around the world. Welcome to the continuing platform of Davos Worldwide. We hope that you're healthy and safe wherever you may be. For us coming from Southern California and the recent LA fires, of course, our hearts go out to all those who are suffering, but there are many suffering around the world. This platform has been built by incredible leaders like Anand and Annika and our entire team to really embrace critical conversations as we enter now 2025. Who would have imagined? Feels like it's going very fast. And now we have an incredible session with the Honorable Gita Irawan Wirjawan, a great friend and brother and a great global leader. Gita is a polymath in every way, an entrepreneur, a public leader, was the Minister of Trade of Indonesia previously, a wonderful, incredible experience in music, in art, and now is a senior fellow at Stanford University, splitting his time between the Door School of Sustainability and the Asia Pacific Research Center. He's going to speak about one of the most critical regions in the world. Now, our attention is obviously drawn to the ongoing conflicts and wars and all sorts of other things that are going on around the world, great power tensions. But we have this incredible region called Southeast Asia, at the center of which are countries like Indonesia, Malaysia, Vietnam, incredible transformation underway, young populations burgeoning onto the scene, economic dynamism, but also incredible complexity. And in many ways, I think it's not overstating to say that the future of the world depends very much on the future of Southeast Asia. And when it comes to Southeast Asia, there's no greater leader and sort of thought leader and action leader when it comes to this region. So we're going to pass it over to Gita. We want to welcome him. We're very grateful, very early, just flown back from Indonesia to California to join us. He's going to make some remarks for about 30 minutes. I promise you it's going to be a tour de force, having listened to him before. And then we'll do a little question and answer to sort of dig deeper on some of the key issues. So welcome, Gita. We're so grateful for you to join us today. Good morning.
Thank you so much, Sanjeev. A very good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to everyone. I'm delighted and honored to be speaking here at the Davos Worldwide Virtual Event. I am originally from Indonesia, and I've been spending the last couple of years or 2.5 years in Palo Alto, trying to spread the message about Southeast Asia, which is a region of around 700 million people, which, in my view, not a lot of people in the world understand well enough, as much as they should and as much as they do with respect to other regions or even countries that are much smaller than this particular region of Southeast Asia. Of the 700 million people, about 250 million are Muslim, 150 million are Christian, and 150 million are Buddhist, and the rest are pretty much spread out into Hindus and different beliefs that live within a region that spans over 5 time zones, from the westernmost village in Myanmar to the easternmost village in Nusa Tenggara, which is the eastern part of Indonesia. Just to give you a sense, that distance between the westernmost part of Southeast Asia to the easternmost part of Southeast Asia is equivalent to the distance between London and Tehran. It's quite large, and it is a region that I think has endured civilizational visits in the last 2,000 years, whereby in the first millennium, the region would have been graced by Buddhism for about 400 years, thereafter by Hinduism for about 600 years, thereon by colonization, Christianity, Islam, and towards the mid part of the 20th century, increasingly countries in Southeast Asia got a taste of independence. As of today, Southeast Asia, which is pretty much made up of 10 countries, are comprised or composed of 4 countries that are monarchical in nature. These are namely Thailand, Cambodia, Brunei, and Malaysia, of which Brunei is the single absolute monarchy, whereas the other three monarchies are, basically with constitutional democracies that have been around for a few decades. As such, they're being run by prime ministerial capacities alongside cabinet members. Whereas the other 6 countries, of which 2 are single political party countries, which are Laos and Vietnam, and the remaining 4 out of the remaining 6 countries are democracies ever since they became independent. These are essentially the Philippines, Singapore, Indonesia, and Myanmar. We can, have a debate about the status of Myanmar, but I think it's important to stress that in the last 2,000 years, in spite of the civilizational visits by so many civilizations from around the world, mainly India and the Arabian Peninsula, and also China, the region has endured in a very peaceful manner by way of not having shed blood with respect to any more than 10 million lives due to differences of opinions or views with respect to ethnicity, sovereignty, religion, or race. And this, I think, compares highly favorably with other regions during the same duration of 2,000-year period, which has witnessed, I think, the shedding of much more blood, particularly that of Europe, which has seen or witnessed the shedding of blood involving close to 200 million lives in the last 2,000 years, of which around 100 to 120 million lives would have been lost just within a span of 30 to 40 years between the First World War and Second World War in the 20th century. I would argue that Southeast Asia, I think, as a baseline, is a region of peace and stability. And this is largely because of what many of us in Southeast Asia would refer to, our ability to embrace the culture of pragmatism, whereas the other culture, which is namely the culture of principles, is something that I think most Southeast Asians are not very good at, of course, with the absolute exception of Singapore, which not only has been able to help the region with respect to living in a very peaceful and stable manner for the last few decades, but they've also been able to embrace the culture of principles in a very deft manner by way of distributing public goods in a very, very judicious manner, inclusive of healthcare, intellect, welfare, and also making sure that the people within the country in Singapore are highly disciplined and socially conscious. Now, in terms of the economic histories of Southeast Asian countries, and also in terms of their economic trajectory going forward, I think it's fair to point out certain areas or attributes that Southeast Asia needs to be working on a little bit better going forward. And this helps, I think, in terms of looking at how the region of Southeast Asia would compare economically with respect to that of China. In the last 30 years, the GDP per capita of Southeast Asia has only grown about 2.7 times as compared to that in China, which has grown at about 10 times. And this has been argued by many people in Southeast Asia as something that I think is attributable to four main attributes. The first is really the massive underinvestment of education by Southeast Asia in the last 30 years. Again, with the absolute exception of Singapore, if we take a look at the educational attainment of Southeast Asia at both the non-tertiary and tertiary levels, most Southeast Asian countries are way below, where China has been in the last 30 years. And this is, by sheer overspending or outspending by the Chinese consistently ever since 1978, but particularly in the last 30 years. At the non-tertiary level, the PISA rankings of China and Southeast Asian countries are starkly different, where China has maintained, the number one position in terms of PISA for so many years until last year when it got toppled by Singapore as the number one holder of the PISA ranking position. PISA, as you might know, is the manifestation of both the lingual and STEM proficiency for the 15-year-olds, where most countries in Southeast Asia do not even pass the global average, which I believe is a score of around 480 to 500. Only two countries in Southeast Asia have passed the global average score in PISA. These are namely Singapore and Vietnam, whereas Indonesia, the Philippines, Thailand, Malaysia, and all the rest are still below the global average. At the tertiary level, most universities in Southeast Asia don't even place within the top 50 rankings of the world, whereas universities in large countries like Indonesia and Thailand don't even place, within the top 100 rankings. And this, I think, is a reflection of basically the lack of spending on education at the tertiary level, but also the lack of recognition in terms of sending, our products of education to all the best schools around the world, which could include those in Japan, China, Australia, Singapore, Europe, and the United States. And the second attribute, which has been a reason for the economic underperformance for Southeast Asia with respect to China, is really the underspending or the massive underspending in infrastructure, where China has been consistently spending between 6 to 9% of its GDP on infrastructure, where most countries in Southeast Asia have not even been spending any more than 2% of their respective GDPs. And this is largely explained by the lack of fiscal space in most countries in Southeast Asia, where most countries in Southeast Asia's tax ratios, which is the ratio of the tax revenues with respect to their respective GDPs, range between only about 9.5% to about 15 to 16%, which is highly below levels of a typical OECD country, which is, above 30%. The third reason as to why Southeast Asia's economy has underperformed with respect to that of China is really what I've been calling the lack of optimum in terms of the intersection between power and talent. This is what many allude to as, competitiveness, governance, where China has paradoxically have been able to democratize talent by selecting talent doggedly based on meritocracy as opposed to patronage and or loyalty, whereas many democracies around the world and many countries in Southeast Asia have been consistently selecting talent a lot more based on patronage and or loyalty as opposed to meritocracy. And this, I think, has served as a discount in terms of governance within all possible domains, not just in policy making or politics, but also in entrepreneurship, in academia and other possible domains where we have not seen the selection of talent based on meritocracy as an evident way of moving forward. The last attribute that I think has caused the economic underperformance for Southeast Asia with respect to that of China is the lack of competitiveness. And this is quite empirically manifested in our inability to issue business licenses. Most countries in Southeast Asia have not been able to issue any more than 2 business licenses on a per 1,000 adult people basis. And the average number of business licenses that Southeast Asia has been able to issue on a per 1,000 adult people basis would have been only about 1, as opposed to 9 to 10 business licenses that China has been able to issue consistently in the last 30 years. Singapore, just to give you an indication, has been able to issue 9 to 10 business licenses on a per 1,000 adult people basis consistently. Indonesia and the Philippines have been able to only issue 0.3 business licenses on a per 1,000 adult people basis. And this, I think, is a reflection of a number of things. The first is what many, I think, would have been able to speculate in terms of the pre-existence of bureaucratic deadweight within all government bureaucracies in Southeast Asia, with the exception of some countries, of course. The second reason as to why business license issuance has not been robust is really the culture, or the lack of culture of entrepreneurialism, which pervades in many places in Southeast Asia. And the third reason as to why business licenses have not been robustly issued on a per 1,000 adult people basis is really the lack of monetary capital. I've explained earlier that the fiscal space in Southeast Asian economies is rather limited, but also the monetary space in Southeast Asian economies is also quite structurally limited. If we take a look at large economies in Southeast Asia, such as those of the Philippines, Indonesia, even Thailand, their money supply to GDP ratios are still below 100%. Singapore, Cambodia, and Vietnam have relatively very large money supply to GDP ratios of about 150%. Indonesia has a money supply to GDP ratio of only about 45%. And this is, economically called the M2, which is really a structural limitation for not only Indonesia's, but also the Philippines' ability to create a much higher degree of entrepreneurial culture. Now, these 4 factors of underinvestment in education, underinvestment in infrastructure, lack of governance, and also lack of competitiveness in terms of the inability to issue business licenses are things that I think most Southeast Asian elites are quite well aware of and are already starting to take a view. Now, this takes us to, I think, issues that are important for the future, if not the near foreseeable future for Southeast Asia. We are sort of like, at a crossroads in terms of, our needing to deal with the 2 superpowers of the world, i.e. China and the US. In my view, the natural intersection between Southeast Asia and China and the US would be in the areas of AI and energy transition. It's evident that China has been highly proactive with respect to intersecting with Southeast Asia in the past 10 to 20 years. This is manifested in, their initiative of the Belt and Road Initiative, which would have basically helped most Southeast Asian countries with respect to their infrastructure development, but also, in helping increase economic activities between the 2 regions in a much more robust manner. As of last year, the trade or the collective trade between China and Southeast Asia would have been about $750 billion. And this has been on the back of China's enjoying, on a net basis, trade surpluses, which would have helped China attain the $1 trillion, overall trade surpluses across the world last year. We are basically also witnessing the structural limitations of China's intentions of exporting capital. And if we peel the onion a little bit more in the context of the Belt and Road Initiative, China's initial initiative in 2013 in the context of the Belt and Road Initiative would have been about for $720 billion for all Southeast Asian economies. Nonetheless, the cumulative realization has not been as favorable as one would have hoped for. It's still around $70 to $80 billion, which is around a tenth of the aspiration of the Chinese to export capital. This, I think, explains to some extent the leadership or the dual circulation economic philosophy of China's leadership in increasing the domestic consumptive propensity of China's economy. And this is quite evident in that China's domestic consumption as a ratio to its GDP has gone up, which I think might explain to some extent relatively, the lower ratio of exportation of goods and services and capital with respect to China's GDP. Now, it's, I think, natural for a number of people in Southeast Asia to think that China has been closer, economically speaking, to the Southeast Asian economies, and this has been manifested in surveys that have depicted public opinions in a number of countries in Southeast Asia which have been leaning and favoring more into China's direction as opposed to the United States direction, with the exception of Vietnam, Singapore, and Myanmar, whereas countries like Thailand, Malaysia, and Indonesia's public opinion has already tilted more towards the Chinese side in the last 10 to 15 years. However, recognizing that there's this structural limitation in terms of China's ability to export capital, it's also important to note that most people in Southeast Asia recognize China's ability to export technological capital. This, I think, takes us to the energy transition component of the intersection between Southeast Asia and China and or the US. If we take a look at the solar panels in California, those in Southeast Asia, those in China, of course, and those in Europe and Africa and other parts of the world, most of these solar panels are already built in China. And I think this is a reflection of how good China has become in terms of allocating technological capital. Indonesia, the Philippines, Malaysia, Vietnam, and the others in Southeast Asia have not attained a modern status. Modernity, in my view, I think is defined at a level of about 6,000 kilowatt hour per capita in terms of electrification on a per capita basis. In Southeast Asia, there's only two countries that are electrified at a level higher than 6,000 kilowatt hour per capita. These are Singapore and Brunei, which are electrified each at about 9 to 10,000 kilowatt hour per capita. If we take a look at the overall power generation capabilities of Southeast Asia, they would be around 400,000 megawatts worth of power generation capabilities built already, most of which are non-renewables. Now, if we were to move the needle to a level where every Southeast Asian country is modern, i.e. being defined at electrification per capita of about 6,000 kilowatt hour, Southeast Asia would need to build about 1 million megawatts worth of power generation capabilities in addition to the pre-existing 400,000 megawatts. This means a requirement of basically attract capital or economic capital amounting to about $2 to $3 trillion on the basis of 1 megawatt costing about $1 to $2 million. Now, I think it's important to note that countries like Indonesia have, only been able to build about 3,000 megawatts of power generation capabilities per year, in addition to its pre-existing 80,000 megawatts. At the rate that Indonesia is only able to build about 3,000 megawatts of power generation capabilities per year, in order for Indonesia to move the electrification per capita 1,300 kilowatt hour to 6,000, it will require about 121 years, a period which is completely irreconcilable with some of the rhetoric that's been uttered, whether it's in Baku, in Dubai, in Glasgow, in Paris, all the way to Copenhagen, at each one of the climate summitries, where we're all supposed to attain carbon neutrality by 2050 or 2060, which are only about 25 to 35 years away, completely irreconcilable with the rate at which countries like Indonesia, have been only able to build about 3,000 megawatts worth of power generation capabilities per year in order to increase its electrification per capita or nationally. This is typical of the other large countries in Southeast Asia, inclusive the Philippines, even Vietnam, Thailand, and Malaysia. Now, it's important to note that not only do we need $2 to $3 trillion to build the extra 1 terawatt worth of power generation capabilities, but we also have to be mindful of where the technology is going to have to come from. I think it's natural for many of us in Southeast Asia to think of China as the natural technological capital allocator. However, given the limitations of capital exportation by China onto Southeast Asia thus far, it's important for Southeast Asia to consider intersecting with the United States and or the G7 countries, which I think are still tremendously blessed with robust liquidity. And this is where I believe the future may have to involve a much more robust intersection between Southeast Asia and the United States for economic capital allocation purposes. FDI has not been moving into Southeast Asia the way we would have wanted, whether it's coming from the US or China or Europe or other parts of the world. If we take a look at the FDI, on a yearly basis, Southeast Asia gets about $200 billion worth of FDI, of which Singapore has been able to get about $100 to $140 billion of those. The others, Vietnam, the Philippines, Thailand, and Malaysia, each would get about $10 to $20 billion, whereas Indonesia in the last 10 years has been getting about $25 to $31 billion. On a per capita basis, each country's ability to attract FDI, inclusive of the large ones, i.e. Indonesia, Thailand, Malaysia, Philippines, and Vietnam, they've been able to get only an FDI on a per capita per year basis of $100 to $400. $100 to $400 on a per capita per year basis, whereas Singapore, which has been able to attract $100 to $140 billion a year, has been able to attract FDI on a per capita per year basis at a rate of about $19,000 to $20,000. So on an absolute and relative basis, Singapore is the absolute example that I think all the other Southeast Asian countries need to emulate. The reason for Singapore's ability to attract massive amounts of capital on an absolute and relative basis would be because of the clarity in terms of the enforceability of rules and regulations. Some people might call that rule of law. This, I think, is or has been the discount with respect to the other Southeast Asian countries, to the extent that the others will be able to work on this particular attribute. I see no reason as to how Southeast Asia would not be able to attract disproportionately larger than the $200 billion worth of FDI every year. And I see no reason as to how countries like Indonesia, the Philippines, Malaysia, Thailand, and Vietnam would not be able to attract much larger amounts than the 10 to $31 billion. Now, there's been rhetoric uttered by some of the leaderships of Southeast Asian countries. I'll use one, for example. This is the one that relates to Indonesia, with respect to the new leadership who's been basically mentioning his desire and ambition to grow the economy at 8% per year. This is something which I've basically commented as something that's not an impossibility, by way of the fact that the baseline growth trajectory for Indonesia is about 5%. In order to attain that delta of 3% as to reach an 8% growth trajectory per year, the 3% in the context of a $1.4 trillion economy only means about $40 billion. And it really simply means, Indonesia's need to attract an FDI of $40 billion more than whatever it has been able to attract at the rate that it's only been able to attract $31 billion per year. It just needs to be able to attract $71 billion worth of FDI on a yearly basis, which is still much smaller than Singapore has been able to attract, which is about $100 to $140 billion. I think the million or billion or trillion dollar question is, the extent to which that Indonesia could work in terms of improving the enforceability of rules and regulations. This is, I think, something that the new leadership is cognizant of, and his team is trying to work on. I am in the camp that believes that the 8% growth trajectory is not something that's going to occur this year, but it's something that's achievable and will be able to be achieved, I think, in the next 2 to 3 years, given the fact that they are already working and taking steps on basically helping, in creating a much more clarity on the enforceability of rules and regulations. Now, the last bit I just want to mention, this is in relation to AI. AI is essentially a hallucination that's being helped by hypnosis that are, I think, coming from different directions. I'm in a camp that believes that the narrative of AI is something that has not been adequately multi-dimensionally given feedback of. At the rate that it's simply just a narrative that's been fed and shaped and reshaped by people of technological expertise, as opposed to those coming from different dimensions, call it culture, spirituality, philosophy, economics, environment. There is a risk that it's not going to become adequately multidimensional, and this, I think, will not resonate to the region of Southeast Asia in a judicious way that some of us may want to see Southeast Asia moving in the direction of. The second comment I want to make about AI is that as much as people think that it is a software related narrative, it is really an engineering related narrative, which involves tremendous degree of scalability and involves tremendous degree of monetization capability. At the rate that Southeast Asia has structural impediments from a fiscal and monetary standpoint, and also its structural limitation in terms of attracting foreign direct investment or economic capital infusion from the rest of the world, there is a bit of a systemic risk in terms of Southeast Asia's ability to embrace, AI capabilities, whether they're coming from China and or the US. Last bit, I just want to mention that at the rate that the global order is or has become a lot more multipolar, a region like Southeast Asia, which is one of 700 million people and diverse as can be, it is the instinct of any large region to try to expand upon its pre-existing strategic autonomy, to try to move up the global ladder. Inevitably, I think there has been and there's likely to be a continuation of revisionism that's going to be exercised by Southeast Asia, whether it's at the individual country level or also at the collective level with respect to the pre-existing order. This, I think, will mark, not only the immediate future of Southeast Asia as a region, which is the fourth or fifth largest economy in the world right now at about $4.2 trillion, the fourth largest population in the world. Of course, Indonesia is already the fourth largest population in the world, which is poised to move up the ladder economically, but also from a population standpoint. So I think this revisionism that's going to be exercised by a region called Southeast Asia is something that's going to have to be shaped in a way that will dovetail in a positive manner for purposes of our intersecting with the two superpowers of China and the US in the context of AI and energy transition. Let me pause right there.
Thank you so much, Gita. And I hope our friends from around the world understand why I said a tour de force. And I hope that out of what Gita shared, we have an even greater appreciation of the tremendous diversity, complexity, but also sort of size and momentum that Southeast Asia represents. Gita, I just want to ask you 3 or 4 questions as we sort of try to wrap up. The first one is really outside of Singapore and Brunei, which of course, higher income level, so forth and so on, smaller countries. Of the rest, the other 9 countries in the region, where do you see the most likely progress over the next, let's say, 3 to 5 years? We're in the SDG era, as you know, of course, and the SDGs are a big part of what we're discussing. 2030, we're almost there, 2/3. Which countries would you put your bets on, or do you see really making the greatest progress over the next, 5 years towards 2030?
Well, I mean, I've been quoted as saying that Vietnam, I think, has invested in the right stuff, and that's really education. Not many years ago, we would never have thought Vietnam was going to be, moving up the ladder as quickly as they have in terms of not just moving up the ladder in PISA. PISA, I think, is structural, right? I mean, their 15-year-olds have scored far better than the rest of Southeast Asia, with the exception of the Singaporeans. And this is a country that had just gone out of the wars in 1975. And I remember Indonesians, Malaysians, Thais, and Filipinos, going to Vietnam to try to help out, immediately after they came out of the wars. And at the tertiary level, it's also quite amazing. If you go to places like South Korea some years ago, the highest number of foreign students in South Korea would have been the Chinese. As of today, it's the Vietnamese. Yeah. And it's just their ability to pick what's important for the future. And this is, I think, inspirational to the other Southeast Asian countries. So having said that, in answer to your question, in the next 5 years, I think Vietnam is going to continue to shine just by their sheer, investment in, at the most basic levels, but also the most sophisticated levels of education. But there is also a risk in terms of, paying a premium for stuff that may not pay up or pay off in the near foreseeable future. But also the geopolitical risks, right? It is too close to China. And so far, I think Vietnam has been a big beneficiary of the China dividends. Who's to say? And one, I think we'll have to find out in the next 5 years as to whether or not that role of being a beneficiary of the China dividends will continue as robustly as we might have seen in the last 5 to 10 years. Not to mention, Vietnam is the only country in Southeast Asia that's had the largest trade surpluses with the U.S. With the new Trumpian posture, I think they're going to have to recalibrate, not only from a trade account standpoint, but also from an overall collaborative economic undertaking standpoint.
Well, it's a perfect segue to the next question. Of course, we are in Inauguration Day, our 47th president of the United States. Donald Trump will be inaugurated today. Also on Martin Luther King Day. Very interesting dynamics happening here, as you know. So you spoke about Vietnam and how it will have to probably adjust, adapt to the second Trump administration. What about the rest of the region? What does Indonesia do, Malaysia do, given what we expect or you expect from a Trump administration second time around?
Well, if we take like the overall contour or landscape of Southeast Asia, it's pretty evident that Malaysia has been very, very proactive in playing the semiconductor narrative. Vietnam, I think, the strategic industries and the automotive, and to some extent the semiconductor, but I think more predominantly in the automotive and strategic industries being steel and all the rest, right? I'm a big believer of steel, without which modernization is not going to be able to take place. Most countries in Southeast Asia, are consuming steel on a per capita per year basis at a rate of still less than 100 kilograms. Modernity is attained only when a country or a nation consumes steel at a rate of 500 kilograms per capita per year. So I think, well, Indonesia is certainly an obvious country of scale, right? It's a large democracy. It's a large, 280 million population country. It's a natural beneficiary of technological capital and economic capital, allocation for purposes of strategic industries and automotives. I don't see Indonesia playing as proactive a role as Malaysia is in semiconductors. Thailand, I think, will play a major role in both agriculture and automotives. Singapore and the Philippines are very much within the services sectors, right? Singapore is at the nano level, at the top echelon of the value chain, whereas the Philippines is at the healthcare level, trying to move up the needle. So that I think is how we in Southeast Asia see ourselves being divvied up, for purposes of capital allocation purposes from the rest of the world. Now, I think the challenge for the rest is, or for all of us rather, is to figure out how to increase our intra-trade. Our intra-trade just amongst ourselves in Southeast Asia is still less than $1 trillion. It's still less than a quarter of the total GDP. I think it speaks of the lack of complementarity with each other, but also speaks of the large egos that are playing into how we're not addressing our structural issues of not having enough complementarity, so that we're producing and sending the same goods and services to other countries, as opposed to producing goods and services that are in complementarity to each other, so that we can serve and service the rest of the world a little bit better.
Building on that, which countries do you think are the most fragile? Are you worried the most about that may be headed in the wrong direction, or whether the structural impediments you spoke about or emerging risks coming in the future?
Well, I mean, the obvious geopolitical risk is South China Sea, right? I mean, I'm in a camp that believes that I think there's a lot less deterrent with respect to Southeast Asia as there are with the Taiwan Strait situation. And when one talks about the South China Seas, we're talking about the four claimant states. These are Vietnam, Cambodia, Malaysia, and the Philippines. I do believe that the Philippines, I think, is a little bit more exposed than the others because they're closer, and I mean, they're also farther in terms of escalating the legal processes. If you asked me 5 to 10 years ago as to whether or not I would have been an optimist with respect to the code of conduct, which we kind of like started discussing with the Chinese. I'm not as optimistic about the code of conduct today as I would have been. I would have been optimistic also with respect to a potential resolution by 2026, I'm not there anymore. I'm not saying that it's completely eliminated, but I think it's just being pushed, towards the back burner. So I think the Philippines is somewhat exposed geopolitically. Now, economically, I think some of the less big countries or the smaller ones are quite, within the peripheries, right? Myanmar, Laos, and Cambodia, I think they're largely exposed to just a single, economic power of China. Different countries have had different experiences. I do believe that the lack of optionalities in any situation, I think, serves as a discount. So those, I think, are some of the economic, countries that have economic exposures.
If I could shift over then in the last two questions, one second to last question is about sort of social dynamics, particularly if you could speak to two groups, identities, women and the transformation of women's empowerment, economic, political, social, cultural, and youth. Obviously, burgeoning youth population, where do you see all, those dynamics really taking individual countries in the region?
Well, it's interesting. Southeast Asia in general is demographically blessed. And on top of that, the women's population or the female portion of the demographics has risen. Some countries are above 50% of the total demographics amongst not only the youth, but on an overall basis. This, I think, has been manifested in increasing, roles in the production sectors, be it agriculture, but also to some extent manufacturing. But what's problematic is, I think overall, the ratio of manufacturing to GDPs in some large economies in Southeast Asia has dropped. Indonesia, for example, used to be about 28% to GDP, the ratio of manufacturing to GDP. It's dropped to about 18%. I could speak similarly about, Thailand and Malaysia, not Vietnam. That, I think, has impeded the kind of progress that we would have envisioned for women. The third, which again serves as a structural limitation for the women, is the lack of monetary space and the lack of fiscal space. As much as we want them to move up the value chain, there is a structural limitation at the rate that Southeast Asian economies have only tax ratios of 9.5% to 15% and monetary space to or money supply to GDP ratios of mostly below 100%. That, I think, could serve as a discount not just for the female portion of the population, but also a discount for the future in terms of our inability to invest, for the future. The last bit, I think it's safe to say in the Philippines and Indonesia and also Malaysia, the role of women in the digital literacy and also micro, small, medium entrepreneurship is so robust that they have, I think it's safer to put money in women as opposed to men, as some of us may say in Southeast Asia. And this has been manifested in how the risk management in the villages of some of these countries has been far better by way of a more proactive role by the women.
That's like last question. If you had a magic wand, what would be one thing you'd like to see change that you think could really be catalytic and transformative for the region?
Well, in a postmodern era, right? It's we're witnessing the young not being able to separate or differentiate between opinions and facts, and at the rate that they don't have the facts or enough facts, it's a lot easier to opine. That, I think, is a concern for me, at least as a parent, but also for purposes of nation building. And I do believe that the right investment in education is key for any developing country, and Southeast Asia is largely developing. So I think being able to educate the public in a robust manner is key. And unfortunately, we have not invested in the right teachers. I'm a believer of teachers as the most essential driver for education as opposed to curricula or technology. I'm a believer that, the right storyteller could convince his or her students as to become physicists
Yes.
better than a physicist not being able to tell stories, right? The right storyteller, I think, is what's needed for Southeast Asia as to enter classrooms. Here's a very troubling or unsettling statistics, right? In most Southeast Asian countries, the households, 85 to 90% of the households, the heads of the households don't have an undergraduate degree, right? So it's wrong to hope for a positive disruption with respect to the educational attainment to take place at the homes, right? The only way for a positive disruption with respect to education is to take place at the schools, where most countries have not invested in the right teachers. Singapore, of course, is the exception. They doggedly select people from the top 20 percentile of institutions or academic institutions to become teachers. South Korea takes it to a different level. They select from the top 5 percentile to teach in schools, whereas most countries in Southeast Asia, they basically get those that would have been rejected by those that have applied to Amazon, Apple, Citibank, Goldman, or McKinsey as to apply to become teachers. So that, I think, is reflected in the lack of quality of educational attainment. That, I think, is something that needs to be game change going forward. And I, to the extent that that gets game change, I will feel very, very much more optimistic about the future of Southeast Asia.
Well, thank you so much, Gita. We're so grateful for your knowledge, your wisdom, your insights. I hope that all of our participants that are listening from around the world have a greater sense, again, of the tremendous opportunity, dynamism, but also challenges and complexities across this incredible region called Southeast Asia. It's having spent not as much time as, of course, Gita has in the region. It really is just an amazing set of experiences, and I encourage everyone to engage actively in this incredible fourth largest region of the world. Thank you, Geeta. Welcome back, and we look forward to engaging much more. For our Davos Worldwide community, there are many more events, as you know, over the next 3-4 days. Please continue to join us and engage in every way that you can. Please stay safe and healthy wherever you may be. Thank you again, Geeta.
Thanks.